My friends, we're gathered here today to discuss a question that has dominated international headlines, sparked intense debate across capitals, and left countless observers scratching their heads in confusion. Why would India, a nation with one of the world's most dynamic economies, choose to sever key trade relationships with the United States? On first glance, it appears to be just another trade spat. America imposes restrictions, India retaliates, America threatens consequences, India pushes back harder. But if we truly want to grasp the real truth behind this decision, we must dig deeper than the headlines, look beyond the immediate politics, and understand the profound forces that shaped this historic moment.
For generations, the United States and India maintained what many called a natural partnership. America served as India's gateway to global markets, purchasing everything from textiles and technology services to pharmaceuticals and precious stones. India, in return, welcomed American agricultural products, machinery, and cutting-edge technology into its vast marketplace. This wasn't merely about economic exchange, my friends. It represented something far more significant, the bridging of two great democratic traditions across oceans, the weaving together of diverse peoples through shared prosperity and mutual opportunity. But here's what we must understand. Trade relationships are never simply about the movement of goods and services. They're fundamentally about respect. They're about whether both nations feel heard, valued, and fairly treated in the arrangement. They're about ensuring that the fruits of globalization reach not just the powerful few, but the many who work, who struggle, who dream of better lives for their children. Over the decades, something began to shift in this relationship. India started to sense that the terms of engagement favored American interests disproportionately. While Indian businesses faced mounting barriers and complex regulations in American markets, American multinational corporations seemed to enjoy relatively unrestricted access to India's enormous consumer base. When such imbalances persist, when one partner feels the scales are tilted against them, tension becomes inevitable. Now, when India ultimately decided to withdraw from these trade arrangements, to reduce or eliminate certain commercial ties with America, this was not an act of aggression. It was not born from animosity or a desire to punish. It was at its core an assertion of self-determination. It was India declaring to the world, we refuse to remain merely a market for others to exploit. We intend to be makers, innovators, competitors, and leaders in our own right. This lesson resonates far beyond India's borders, my friends. It speaks to every nation navigating the complexities of our interconnected global economy. Because here's the fundamental truth. When a country takes control of its economic destiny, it's not choosing isolation from the world. It's choosing dignity. It's choosing to write its own story rather than accept a supporting role in someone else's narrative. For India, a civilization spanning millennia, home to 1.4 billion souls, a nation that has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, this choice represented not just policy, but destiny. It was, in many ways, inevitable. Yet let us not forget this essential truth. Even when trade agreements crumble, even when economic policies diverge sharply, the bonds between peoples run deeper than any tariff schedule. These connections, forged by students pursuing dreams in foreign lands, families building bridges across continents, entrepreneurs solving global challenges together, these human ties cannot be easily severed by government declarations or policy disputes. But to truly comprehend why India chose to step back from its commercial relationship with America, we cannot simply examine yesterday's disputes or last year's negotiations. We must journey back through time, tracing the complex evolution of how these two nations, separated by vast oceans, distinct cultures, and different stages of development, first came together, gradually drifted apart, and repeatedly attempted to find stable common ground through economic cooperation. Trade relationships, you see, are never frozen in time. They evolve constantly, shaped by shifting global dynamics, changing domestic priorities, and each nation's evolving understanding of its place in the larger story of human progress. When India achieved independence in 1947, its founding leaders embraced a vision centered on self-reliance. The wounds of colonial exploitation remained fresh and painful.
For 2 centuries, India had been systematically reduced to a supplier of raw materials for distant imperial powers, while its own industrial potential was deliberately suppressed. Consequently, in those crucial early decades after independence, India adopted an economic model that was cautious, protective, and deliberately inward-focused. The nation invested heavily in building domestic heavy industries, established state-controlled enterprises, and carefully shielded its emerging markets from external competition that might overwhelm local businesses before they could establish strong roots. America, during this same period, was experiencing unprecedented economic expansion, extending its global reach and actively promoting open market policies worldwide. Naturally, these two approaches created fundamental misalignment. Their priorities were simply incompatible during those years. India prioritized preserving hard-won sovereignty while rebuilding its economy from the ground up. The United States sought partners willing to embrace openness and integrate into a global economic order largely designed according to American principles and American interests. But history, as we know, never stands still. By the 1980s and 1990s, the global economic landscape was undergoing dramatic transformation. The Cold War was drawing to a close. Globalization was accelerating at breathtaking speed. India found itself confronting a severe balance of payments crisis, a moment when its inward-looking economic model was no longer financially sustainable. This crisis forced a pivotal decision. In 1991, India undertook comprehensive economic reforms, dramatically reducing tariffs, actively encouraging foreign investment, and liberalizing markets that had been protected for decades. This marked the genuine turning point when India began its full integration into the global economy. America quickly recognized the enormous potential of this vast new market opening before them. Trade between the two nations began expanding rapidly from this foundation. What followed became a story of both remarkable collaboration and persistent conflict. On one hand, American technology companies discovered the exceptional talent of Indian engineers, the efficiency of Indian service centers, and the innovative capabilities of Indian entrepreneurs. India evolved into a global hub for outsourcing, software development, and pharmaceutical manufacturing. In exchange, Indian businesses gained unprecedented access to American capital, American consumer markets, and American technological expertise. This represented genuine collaboration at its finest. However, simultaneous conflicts emerged and deepened over time. American agricultural interests complained bitterly about India's domestic farming subsidies, arguing they created unfair competitive disadvantages. Indian manufacturers countered by pointing to what they considered excessively high American tariffs on textiles, steel, and other products crucial to India's export economy. Washington consistently raised concerns about intellectual property protections in India, while New Delhi pushed back against demands they viewed as potentially devastating to domestic industries and access to affordable medicines for ordinary citizens. Each side genuinely believed the other wasn't playing by fair rules. And because trade disputes are never purely economic but deeply connected to questions of national identity and respect, these disagreements carried emotional weight far beyond mere spreadsheets and profit calculations. The relationship grew even more complex due to broader shifts in global power dynamics during the early 2000s. China's extraordinary rise became the defining factor, reshaping international trade relationships. America sought India as a democratic counterweight and strategic partner in Asia. India, meanwhile, sought recognition as a legitimate global power in its own right, not merely as a junior partner in someone else's strategic vision. Consequently, while trade continued expanding, the underlying conversations were never limited to dollars and cents. They encompass questions of influence, of who gets to establish the rules governing global economic relationships, of who deserves a seat at the table when crucial decisions affecting billions of lives are made. Domestic political pressures also played increasingly significant roles. In the United States, political leaders faced mounting pressure from workers who felt abandoned by globalization, who watched jobs migrate overseas, and who demanded that America prioritize protecting its own industries and communities. In India, leaders confronted the legitimate demands of a youthful population hungry for employment opportunities, economic advancement, and national dignity.
This meant protecting small farmers from unfair competition, nurturing emerging local businesses, and ensuring that India developed into more than just a consumer of foreign products, but rather a producer, a creator, an innovator in its own right. These domestic political realities inevitably shaped how both countries approached trade negotiations. Every tariff decision, every subsidy policy, every agreement had to be filtered through the lens of domestic political considerations. Politicians in both nations had to answer to their own citizens first. Then there's the crucial question of evolving national self-perceptions. America has long viewed itself as the architect of global economic order, the champion of free trade principles, the nation that rightfully sets international standards. India, by contrast, sees itself as a civilization rising from centuries of exploitation, determined to protect its sovereignty while equally determined to claim its rightful place as a leader representing the developing world's interests. These contrasting self-images inevitably clashed when trade disputes arose. From America's perspective, India's resistance sometimes appeared to be obstruction for its own sake. From India's viewpoint, American demands often seemed like pressure to accept a permanently subordinate position in the global hierarchy. Yet throughout all these tensions and disagreements, genuine partnership continued to flourish in many areas. Joint business ventures were established and thrived. Students and scholars moved freely between universities, enriching both societies. Indian products became fixtures in American households, while American technology powered Indian economic growth. The people-to-people connections, the marriages, the friendships, the cultural exchanges created bonds that ran deeper than any government policy or tariff dispute. So when you hear today that India has stepped back from trade relationships with America or that negotiations have collapsed, remember this didn't happen overnight. This is the culmination of decades of complex history. It's the story of two proud nations that came together with hope, tried earnestly to cooperate, sometimes succeeded brilliantly, sometimes stumbled badly, but always continued moving forward according to their own understanding of their national interests and values. The real truth is that trade relationships between the United States and India have always represented a delicate balancing act between cooperation and competition, between openness and protection, between the relentless demands of globalization and the legitimate needs of domestic politics and national pride. As the world continues changing, as new powers rise and assert themselves, as traditional rules face fresh challenges, this balance will continue shifting. What we witness today is not the end of a relationship between two great nations. It is simply one more chapter in a long, complex, and still unfolding history. And if we study this history carefully, we'll understand that nations make trade choices not merely because of numbers on financial ledgers, but because of who they are, where they've come from, and where they hope to lead their people in the years ahead. When most people encounter the phrase trade dispute, they immediately picture technical discussions about import quotas, arguments over tariff percentages, or bureaucratic negotiations about agricultural subsidies. They imagine government officials sitting across conference tables debating the precise tax rate on steel imports or the appropriate level of protection for pharmaceutical patents. On the surface, that's exactly what trade disputes appear to be. They seem technical, policy-focused, concerned primarily with the mechanics of moving goods from one nation to another. But if you look deeper, if you examine the human emotions and national aspirations driving these disputes, you'll discover something far more profound. You'll see that trade disputes are rarely just about commerce. They're fundamentally about sovereignty. They're about fairness and justice, and they're about the distribution of power in a world that's no longer dominated by a single superpower, but increasingly shaped by multiple centers of influence. Consider sovereignty first. For a nation like India, sovereignty isn't merely a political concept, it's the hard-won fruit of centuries of struggle against domination. For generations, India endured colonial rule where economic policies were dictated not by elected representatives of the Indian people, but by foreign administrators whose primary concern was extracting wealth for distant empires. These administrators decided which crops Indian farmers would grow, which goods would be exported, and who would profit from India's natural resources and human labor.
This historical memory isn't simply academic history gathering dust in textbooks. It lives in the national consciousness, shaping how India's leaders and citizens view any situation where outsiders attempt to dictate domestic economic policies. So when America or any other foreign power tells India which tariffs to eliminate, which markets to open, or which regulatory standards to adopt, the issue transcends mere economics. It becomes a fundamental question of independence and self-determination. That's why when disputes arise, say, over agricultural support programs or data protection regulations, India doesn't view these as purely technical disagreements about optimal policy. Instead, these become tests of whether India will shape its own destiny or submit to pressure from abroad, whether it will make decisions based on what's best for the Indian people or what foreign governments and corporations demand. For the United States, this Indian perspective can sometimes feel frustrating and unnecessarily confrontational. American leaders often argue, why won't India simply agree to these terms? They're economically beneficial, they'll promote growth and efficiency. But for India, the calculation involves different factors entirely. Indian leaders ask, do these proposed changes serve our farmers and workers? Do they protect our emerging industries? Do they allow us to develop according to our own timeline and priorities? And if the answers are negative, then the disagreement isn't about a technical policy detail. It's about sovereignty and the right of nations to govern themselves.
The second layer of these disputes involves questions of fairness and justice. In theory, global trade should create mutual benefits, with all participating nations gaining from expanded markets and increased efficiency. But in practice, countries don't enter negotiations from positions of equal strength. Wealthier nations possess greater leverage, more sophisticated negotiating resources, and more influence over the international institutions that establish trading rules. Developing nations frequently feel that the global trading system is structurally biased against their interests, that they're being asked to open their markets to foreign competition while powerful economies continue protecting their own sensitive industries. For India, fairness has always been central to its trade policy approach. Indian negotiators argue that their farmers, many living near poverty levels, cannot be expected to compete directly with heavily subsidized agricultural businesses from wealthy Western nations. They insist that intellectual property rules must not come at the expense of affordable medications for millions of people who desperately need life-saving treatments. From America's perspective, fairness appears different. American companies invest enormous resources in research and development, creating innovative products and technologies. They argue that their intellectual property deserves protection, that their goods should have reasonable access to India's large consumer market without facing discriminatory barriers.
So when India resists certain American demands, America often interprets this as protectionism or unfair rejection of free trade principles. But if you step back and examine both perspectives objectively, you'll see that both sides are genuinely seeking fairness. They simply define fairness differently. For one side, fairness means protecting investments and innovations. For the other side, fairness means protecting livelihoods and ensuring that global economic integration doesn't devastate local communities. Finally, trade disputes reflect broader questions about global power distribution. We now live in what scholars call a multipolar world. This means that power and influence are no longer concentrated in one or two dominant nations, but are distributed across many centers: America, China, the European Union, India, and others. Each of these powers is working to shape the global order in ways that reflect their own interests, values, and vision of how the world should work. Trade policy serves as one of the primary arenas where this competition for influence plays out. For decades, America largely wrote the rules of international trade through institutions like the World Trade Organization and through bilateral agreements with smaller partners. But now, emerging powers like India want meaningful voices in rule-making processes. They don't simply want to follow existing rules, they want to help create new rules that better reflect today's multipolar reality. This power dynamic influences every major trade dispute. When America pressures India to reduce certain tariffs, it's not just about market access. It's about America asserting its traditional role as the leader of the global trading system.
When India resists these pressures, it's not just about protecting specific industries, it's about demonstrating that India is no longer a junior partner that accepts diktat. Ion from abroad. India is sending a message to the world. We are a rising power with our own legitimate interests, and our voice deserves to be heard and respected. Consider the broader global context. Over the past 2 decades, China has emerged as a dominant trading power, challenging American economic leadership in many regions. The United States has responded by seeking to maintain its influence through various means, including closer partnerships with democratic allies like India. Meanwhile, India has positioned itself as a voice for developing nations worldwide, arguing for fairer international rules that give all countries, not just the wealthiest, genuine opportunities for growth and development. So when India pushes back against American trade demands, it's not simply about protecting its own economy, though that's certainly important. It's about staking a claim in the global balance of power. It's about telling the world that the era of any single nation writing rules for everyone else is ending. We're entering a new phase where multiple voices will shape international economic governance. Behind every trade dispute, we must remember are real people with real lives affected by these policy decisions. A small farmer in Punjab who depends on government price supports to keep his crops affordable for local consumers. A factory worker in Ohio whose job security depends on steel pricing and import competition. A scientist in California who spent years developing innovative treatments and wants her intellectual property protected. A patient in Delhi who needs life-saving medications at prices his family can afford. These individuals don't think in terms of abstract economic theories or geopolitical strategies. They think about daily survival, about dignity, about providing for their families and having hope for the future. When governments argue about tariff rates or subsidy levels, those arguments ultimately reflect these fundamental human concerns and aspirations. So when you hear about a trade dispute between India and America, don't limit your thinking to taxes on agricultural products or duties on manufactured goods. Think about sovereignty, a nation's right to make its own choices. Think about fairness, ensuring that the benefits of global trade reach ordinary people, not just powerful corporations. Think about power. Who gets to shape the future in a world where multiple nations are rising and asserting their rightful place? The real truth is that trade disputes serve as mirrors reflecting national identity, historical experience, and future ambitions. They reveal how nations see themselves and how they want to be seen by the world. Until we recognize this deeper reality, we'll never fully understand why these disputes matter so profoundly or why they touch such sensitive nerves in national political discussions. When India made its decision to step back from certain trade arrangements with America, many international observers immediately labeled it a breakdown in relations, a confrontation, even a rejection of global economic integration. But if we examine this decision within a broader historical context, we'll see that India's choice isn't unique or unprecedented. It's part of a worldwide trend that's unfolding across continents, nations asserting greater independence in designing their economic policies, in shaping their domestic priorities, and in choosing how to engage with globalization on their own terms rather than accepting terms dictated by others. For decades after World War II, the framework of global trade was largely established by a small group of powerful nations. Institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization were created primarily under the leadership of the United States and its closest allies. The underlying philosophy was straightforward and in many ways admirable: prevent the kind of economic collapse that had contributed to global warfare and create common rules that would bind nations together through mutually beneficial trade relationships. In principle, this approach achieved remarkable success, generating decades of unprecedented prosperity for many regions of the world. However, there was a fundamental problem with this system. The rules weren't truly neutral. They reflected the priorities, economic strengths, and strategic interests of the nations that designed them. Wealthy countries with advanced industries and powerful multinational corporations naturally favored policies promoting open markets, strong intellectual property protections, and minimal restrictions on cross-border capital flows. Developing nations, by contrast, often found themselves pressured to open their economies before their domestic industries were sufficiently mature to compete, sometimes at significant cost to their farmers, workers, and emerging businesses. India's experience exemplifies this broader pattern perfectly. Throughout most of the 20th century, India maintained a relatively closed economy, deeply suspicious of repeating the patterns of economic dependency that had characterized its colonial experience. But in 1991, facing a severe financial crisis, India dramatically liberalized its economy, opening doors